I'm walking among the throngs of tourists here outside of Buckingham Palace, or as some of the more crass people call it, Buck House. And this may be a strange place in which to be recording this, but there are those legends did those feet in ancient times. William Blake's poem that turned into that wonderful song, Jerusalem, thinking that Jesus actually did come to these shores. Of course, that's just a legend. We always want to identify with the ideas of the Bible in our own locality, and thinking of the early church leaders, none of them made it here, not to England, and that's a kind of a tragedy for us who come originally from England. We would like to think that we own something of this, but let's think about those early church leaders. You have Peter, you have James, who's killed very soon, Philip the evangelist, you have Stephen, also martyred. You have all these different leaders there in the early church who are really dedicated to spreading the good news to everybody that they meet. Those people who say that, well, actually, Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples and that's how they made up all these stories. Would you really die for that kind of idea, knowing that it was all spurious, that you had just made it up? I don't think so. They were absolutely convinced they had met the risen Lord, and so they go on and share it. Now, of course, later on, Paul comes into the picture. Well, I've come to a little quieter area. It was getting a little difficult stumbling over all the tourists there outside the palace. And let's get to that second missionary journey of Paul, thinking about all those people had gone before, but it was Paul who went out there on these missionary journeys. We already talked about the first one. This is the second one, and I think this is kind of my favorite, although they're all really good, mainly because this is Paul actually going into Europe. Macedonia, of course, is part of Europe, what we call Greece today, and he was the very first missionary to take the gospel, as far as we know, into Europe. He didn't get to England, as I just said, but he did get into Europe. And it also contains so much of that other really vibrant material. That story about him being locked up there in the jail and the earthquake setting them loose, the jailer coming in, all of that. So exciting stuff. And then Paul trying out different methodologies of how to reach different people groups. There in Athens, up there on the Areopagus, he's invited to address these philosophers, the other people there, to explain about this belief that he has. And he chooses to point to one of their shrines because he says they're very religious, or even the word could be superstitious. I see that you're very religious and you even have a shrine to the unknown God. Well, that's the one I want to talk to you about. And he goes on to explain God as revealed in Jesus. A tremendous story of faith in action, sharing the wonderful good news for everybody around. And then he moves on to Corinth and meets up with Priscilla and Aquila in order to continue his witnessing. And in this missionary journey, we won't go into all the details of the sites, you can look it up. And Paul is sharing the most exciting news you could ever preach with people around. Jesus died, he rose again, and he's coming back. What a wonderful message that he had, and so do we. May God bless you as you think of these things.